All right, so we're on to our last presentation. Hal, if you just want to grab a seat over there, that'd be great. Now, a lot of you have seen Hal's bio in the materials, but I'll just highlight some of the key points. So Hal is principal of Elevate to Lead, where he does leadership coaching. He has extensive entrepreneurial and leadership experience both in the business and nonprofit sector, so it's great that a lot of what we've talked about so far, he's actually been in both sides of the equation. He started his career as a systems engineer at Ford Aerospace, Newport Beach, California, and had numerous growth opportunities, resulting in being the fastest promoted engineer in the history of that division of 3,000 people. So this is someone who's been in the workforce and proven his ability. He was previously VP Process Excellence. I know in the US it's process. You're probably wondering what that is. It's either process or process. But at Lockheed Martin Space Systems Company, Littleton, Colorado, where he led streamlining of tools and processes for the $9 billion organization. He was a member of an executive team of 4 that grew a high-tech company from 19 employees and $2 million in annual revenue to 200 employees and $40 million in annual revenue. So lots of success. Last thing I'll mention is he is founder and board chair of a nonprofit called Pearl, which we'll get into discussing. It's a great ministry, which provides hope and stability to single-parent families through free safety repairs, the vehicles, clothing, childcare, sponsorships, mentoring, and financial training. So a huge amount of experience. So I'm looking forward to having a really engaging Q&A. I've got a number of questions to get started, and as I mentioned, just text me the questions and I'll integrate them.
Thank you, Doug. I feel like I'm following in the footsteps of giants up here. More of the regular guy, and hopefully I can speak to that.
Yeah. Well, it's great I always like when we have these events that we try to get people from different backgrounds, different places. So, of course, Hal is from Littleton, Colorado, so we've got U.S. perspective along with perspectives from people from different parts of Canada. So just to start off with, so I think this is a relevant question for people also who are students. So you started off as an engineer, and that's your university training, but it evolved into leadership positions and over time away from your core engineering expertise. So maybe just describe how that journey transpired.
Well, I think they found out that I wasn't as good of an engineer as I needed to be, so they promoted me to management.
Again, a very valuable takeaway. Yes. If you're not good at yourself, just get yourself promoted.
I was trained as an electrical engineer. That's how I went through school. But really, my focus, I had a hard time just sitting there and focusing on designing a circuit for a long period of time. My passion was seeing how everything came together and worked as a complete sensor. And I was into laser systems. So, the mechanical, the software, the optics, and how it all worked together to solve the big problem. And that just led into project management, which then led into, higher levels of responsibility with leadership.
Now, you mentioned, or that in your bio, it describes your involvement in some pretty large companies. And this is to focus on or to talk about entrepreneurial principles. So when you've worked with these large companies, describe what the entrepreneurial culture was like and how you make larger organizations entrepreneurial.
The million-dollar question. Because I went from right out of school in a small company to a big company, Ford Aerospace, and then back into a small company, grew that, and then we sold it to Lockheed Space Systems Company. So then I was a senior executive back into that space for 5 years. And there's success stories out there how the large companies have succeeded at keeping innovation in the entrepreneurial spirit. I'm not sure I've experienced that in my career. Mostly in my career, I have found that to be very difficult to do in large companies. And I think the example was, and it was so crystal clear to me when we had our laser company and I had 30 PhDs working with me and so on. And then we sold it to Lockheed Martin. And, everything in Lockheed Martin Space Systems Company, the whole culture was geared at no risk, right? So if you compare that, so if you have the R&D company, it was all about you fail, succeed, and you're a hero. And that's how the reward systems were set up. And that's how our customer base was set up to wanting us to do that. That's how we pushed the frontiers. Then you get into Lockheed, and Lockheed was, you don't fail. I mean, if you fail, you get fired, right? So everything about the DNA and the culture was about not taking risk and not failing.
I mean, maybe describe what Lockheed Martin is about, because not every people would probably be familiar with the name, but not the scope and what they do exactly.
Well, they do a lot. The part of Lockheed I was in was Space Systems Company. So Space Systems Company, you know, we were 15,000 people, and I was a senior executive, and it was all about launching satellites into space for both commercial and military applications. So anywhere from building the actual launch vehicle to the satellites to the sensors that went on there. Other parts of Lockheed, of course, are building fighter jets and weapons and defensive things and so on. Shipping ports even. But the part I was focused on was space-based work. So the culture, for Lockheed to be successful, the culture it was important that they not fail, because if you have a satellite that fails in space, it's really hard to go fix it. So, you know, I mean, there was a reason for that. But I don't want to make this whole discussion about how Lockheed and our R&D company. I'm just saying that for large companies to continue to be innovative and entrepreneurial, you really have to look at those risk and those reward systems that are in their DNA. Everything from the financial systems to the HR systems can steer a group one way or another. And they often don't even recognize how much that is ingrained in them and why it's so difficult for them to do. That's why they end up buying a bunch of companies to keep the innovation going. And then it's a really painful process when it doesn't work, because all of a sudden now they're subjected to the same fiscal reviews and HR reviews that the rest of the company is, and it's completely orthogonal to how the innovation cycle works. Yeah. So it's a tough problem to solve.
Yeah, I think that's the vexing question, and for all of you, part of the audience, you know, one of the challenges always seems to be that you have larger organizations that we wish would be more entrepreneurial, but they're not, and it seems logical that they should be, and yet, you know, for example, you may be working for a large company, a large nonprofit, and you may be wondering, why are they not more receptive to my innovative idea? So do you find, just in general from your experience, is it the people who may be the hurdle, or the culture, or how do you drive that entrepreneurial change?
It's never down to a person or an individual. It's a culture thing. And that culture word is so general that it's hard to dissect that. But the culture is the unwritten assumptions that people make when they're making priority decisions. So if you have this idea and you want to be entrepreneurial and you have all this passion for it, but your boss or whatever the leadership team it is that you're presenting to, they may have these unwritten assumptions already going in their head, like, well, we would never do that. That would be too high a risk. So I think if you are going to do that, it's about the one-on-one conversations to understand what you're walking into. Otherwise, you're going to go in there and just have your head handed to you. And it's not because they're against you. You know, they don't even actually probably fully understand why it is that they have these unwritten assumptions, but they're there. It's in the DNA.
Mm-hmm. So you've had this range of experience from these large, you know, a very, very large company to entrepreneurial high growth companies. So what was the culture of the entrepreneurial high growth company that made it succeed so well?
Always trying, never being afraid to fail, and not getting penalized if you failed. Now, at some point, you have to succeed, or you lose your customers, right? Mm-hmm. But there's a higher tolerance level there in order to be able to. And what is fail? I mean, everybody worries about their reputation, about their technical reputation, their business reputation. You still have to answer the banks. You still have cash flow that you have to pay attention to. So I'm not just saying you have carte blanche to fail, but you do have risk, and I think there is a sense of purpose there that comes with it that keeps that fire going. I mean, some of the entrepreneurs I admire the most, the founder of the company, the laser company that I worked in, the guy he was always an optimist. I don't care how bad it looked, he was an optimist. The rest of us are looking at each other like, oh my God, we're in trouble. And he's like, yeah, no problem. Just do this, this, this. And it's like, that makes no sense. We're doomed. But somehow we always made it through it. Because he just had a sense of purpose and an optimism that flame never went out.
What was it, like the Steve Jobs alternate reality field?
No, I wouldn't put him in the same category as Steve Jobs. He was actually, my founder was actually conflict avoidant and very soft-spoken, and so a different form of leadership style than Steve Jobs, but it worked for him.
Right. Well, one of the things you refer to in your bio is this idea of the necessity to collaborate with a lot of people to get things done.
Uh-huh.
So maybe describe how you go about collaborating with people rather than the default, which is often you protect your turf, you have your idea, you're not looking to collaborate, you're looking to somehow, more of a zero-sum approach. So what's collaboration about, and why does it work so well?
Well, what it's about is working with others to come up with your ideas and your solutions. I would say that the first majority of my career, I wasn't very good at collaborating. I actually was all about having the best team in the company, right? I mean, I invested in my team, and we were going to have the best team in the company, and we were going to have a better team than everybody else. And I thought that was actually how I was being rewarded and what I should be doing. Later in my career, I've came to learn that actually wasn't serving the company very well, and nor do I believe it was serving me very well. But I had to learn that the hard way. Patrick Lencioni, has this concept in his book, The Advantage, that who's your first team? Who's the team you put the priority with? And it should be your colleagues, right? It's that leadership team that are your colleagues is your first team, and the people that report to you, that's your second team. And so that's where you dedicate your decision-making and have all your hard conversations is your first team. And then your second team will follow along with that. And that's what keeps them driving silos in organizations. So me being proud of increasing the silos early in my career because I was so good at building teams was probably a little misguided. But we all learn along the way.
Mm-hmm. So if you summarize the notion of being an entrepreneurially minded leader, what would be some of the 2 or 3 key aspects of that?
And if I look at my notes, it's because I'm a notes guy. Okay, I've been a notes person my whole life, so please don't take that personally. As far as entrepreneur, we already talked about, and we also heard from Mark and Steve and the others about being willing to fail and learning from it. I think the second point was it's that sense of purpose, that clear sense of purpose. Now, you can talk about that in a secular sense. And a good part of my career, it was for me in a secular sense. And then later in my career, I also saw it as a kingdom purpose. And we're going to get into the nonprofit and so on in a minute. But I think it's such a powerful force as part of being entrepreneurial as to why you're doing it. What is the why on that? And then finally, and this is not for everybody, but for me, it was learning how to value the relationships, build those relationships and value the relationships of the people around me. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs I know are those that have just been so strong in those relationships. And me coming up through engineering school, it wasn't about the relationships, it was about being the smartest person in the room. Right? Well, that didn't serve me so well. My wife, my wife and I have been in business together for the last 12 years. she's helped cure me of that. So I think the relationships is a key part of entrepreneurism. Yeah.
Well, the one question that I was, really excited to talk to you about is, so Hal mentioned that he came back to his faith in his 40s. And so maybe just describe the journey of your faith, the faith experience originally, and then why you ended up coming back to it in your 40s.
Okay. Did Steve and Mark leave the room? Good. Okay, because I'm going to say, so I was raised Catholic. Altar boy, the fancy stuff and ringing the bells and stuff. And parochial school, the whole bit. And as a teenager, I ran away from the Catholicism. It wasn't the fault of anybody in the church or anybody else. It was kind of my analytical brain. If you couldn't give me evidence that God existed and prove things to me, then, I needed to move on and focus on things that could be proven to me. I was really into science. I wanted to be an astronaut. So it was that science brain. Just wasn't working with the Catholicism. So I wasn't really even besides, I was going into party mode. I didn't really want to spend the time trying to figure it out, right? It was a lot easier to go to college and just get away from my faith. So then, in my early 40s, we started looking for a church for the kids because that's what a good dad is supposed to do, right? We checked out all the Catholic churches, and really they didn't have the programs for our kids. We ended up at a non-denominational Christian church run by Rick Rusaw called Life Bridge. It's a pretty large church, a few thousand people down in the Denver area. And I sat there, I have a great kids program, right? And I sat there for like a year with my arms crossed. And finally I'm like, well, this is actually pretty good stuff. And Rick had a great way of taking what was in the Bible and relating it to real life. And Rick was raising kids that were the same age as mine.
If I can just interject there
Sure.
quickly. So Rick Rusaw is our mutual friend that connected us. And if any of you are interested, his last name is spelled R-U-S-A-W. So Rick Rusaw. He's written a number of books. Extremely engaging fellow. Anyways, if you're interested in just learning a bit more about his church and some of the books he's written, that's his name. You can just Google him.
And I think they invited him to be here for this, but when he couldn't make it, I was second best. So, so Rick helped change my life, right? And so, I think he planted that seed in me about the Bible. Okay, and there's another section I could talk to that if we have time or over drinks in terms of the importance of me finding the Bible. I think that, and I think the other critical thing that happened for me right around that time was I read Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, which it really spoke to my analytical brain, because that's who Lee Strobel is. And I started putting the pieces together, and I started seeing that, hey, I was in a leadership training class at work, and I was going through some leadership training in the faith-based side through Rick Rusaw, and I said, what do you know? They're the same thing. Just one put it in secular terms and one put it in biblical terms, right? So all those pieces started coming together. And I've been on that journey since, and learning and growing along the way. There is a book I just finished called Person of Interest by J. Warner Wallace. He's a cold case investigator, so it's very much a Lee Strobel-like book, but he comes at it from a different angle. So, he's a cold case investigator, and he walks you through this one case he's solving, and at the same time he's walking you through how do you apply this to knowing if Jesus really existed and so on. It was a fascinating book for the analytical brain.
So a question just came in. This relates back to entrepreneurial leadership. So isn't culture greatly influenced by the founders and top managers? So how can these influential leaders nudge an organization towards being more open to innovation? So in a sense, the role of leadership. So let's say people in this room are leaders in organizations. How can they push the organization or lead the organization that way?
Yeah, I think the obvious things are, reward systems and so on. But I think more than that, and I'll use a term, you got to fly cover for those that are sticking their neck out. So provide a layer of protection, because there's going to be parts of the organization that when somebody fails at something the first time or the second time or the third time, it's going to want to attack, right, and push that person out. People are competitive. They're going to want to, so to be able to stick with that individual who is, or that group within your organization that is being entrepreneurial, and provide cover for them so they can continue to be in that space. And that cover comes from not so much the other scientists or engineers or production. It can come from the finance team, or it can come from the HR team. It can come from all the aspects of the organization. They got to know that part of the company is valued, right? And therefore, everybody's going to see that.
Mm-hmm. So, because I think it's quite a practical question. So if someone wants to make the organization more entrepreneurial, and of course this could happen, the title of the presentation is How to Be Entrepreneurial in Business, Nonprofits, and Churches. So if we think of, if you're in a church context, often doing something new, unique, different, if it has a possibility of failure. For entrepreneurs, failures would be one more step, but for a lot of people, that it's a one-time opportunity. Nonprofits, if a nonprofit tried something and lost $100,000, would the donors be...
Did that, but yeah.
Okay. So how do you... So you talked about having the cover. So would you say before somebody wants to do something entrepreneurial, they really need to assess their position in the organization, make sure they have support, make sure it's not too great of a financial risk?
Right, and so this is going to look a little different depending if you're the CEO or the executive director of the nonprofit versus somebody in the organization. You have to do it smart, right? It's not. This isn't like taking careless or reckless risk. You have to do it smart. And so, if you're the boss, it's about setting expectations. In terms of here's what we're going to go and do our best at doing, and here's how we're going to do it. And oh, by the way, we're going to stub our toe, and we're going to find out this is actually not working, and then we're going to adjust course and try again. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, if I was if I wasn't the boss and I was in the organization, then there's a lot of homework you have to do, because you have to go around and get your coalition built as to why this is going to make sense. This isn't like showing up in a conference room and giving a presentation, and then everybody's all excited and agrees to it, and boom, you're off and running. I've never seen that work. It certainly didn't work for me. I did try it once, and my head was like rolling across the conference room floor. I went home and sat in the hot tub and licked my wounds. And I went back and I did it differently a couple months later and had success. So it really does take time to go build those coalitions. And think of the collaborative approach. You don't just go in and say, boom, this is how it's going to be, and it's that way. It takes everybody's ideas, and they're going to refine your thinking along the way. And you're going to learn where the risks are even within your own organization.
Is that one of the challenges for any entrepreneurial person, that they are often non-collaborative, that they may be their own worst enemy?
Certainly. Certainly. There's a, I wrote a quote here that I want to get right, so I'm going to read it, because it comes to that. How many entrepreneurs in here have very low self-confidence? Right. How many?
Yeah, put your hand up
Yeah.
really high so we can see them.
I have low self-confidence, yeah. How many of you in here maybe have, or have been told that maybe you have an abundance of confidence? Okay, so I'm the only one. Okay.
No, Bruce has an
Bruce,
abundance of confidence.
Okay, good. Thank you, Bruce.
But he's raising his hand way in the corner where I'm not sure anybody can see.
I think, and I'm looking at my quote here. Because when I wrote this, my wife said it totally sounded right, so I wanted to make sure I got it right. Self-awareness in symbiotic balance with self-confidence to give oneself permission to recognize personal growth areas. All right, so let me say it again. So if you have self-awareness, if you're highly confident and you have self-awareness, you got to have a certain amount of ego in order to run an organization or to be entrepreneurial, right? If you have no ego and no self-confidence, you're not going to get there. But if you don't have any self-awareness, right, as to what your strengths and your weaknesses are, then you're going to get in trouble as an entrepreneur, right? Not all of us can be Steve Jobs, where you just have so much brilliance you can just push it through and get it done, right? So if you have that self-awareness to give yourself permission to understand those areas of personal growth, to me, that is so core to what does it take to be a successful entrepreneur and to scale a business into becoming more than what it is, because you're basically then scaling yourself. You're scaling yourself in order to scale the business, right? And because I think that's the other challenge when you're scaling a business is so often either for you or any members of your leadership team, the position can quickly outgrow the person. So if that person is not learning and growing themselves to staying just a step ahead of the growth of the company that's needed, right, then what are you going to do? You either got to move them off to another role and hire somebody who can do it, or you're going to get really hamstrung by that, right? So I think it's hugely important to, number one, be able to learn and grow yourself. Number two, to be able to have enough humility and self-awareness to know what you need to personally learn and grow. And then number three, keeping yourself mentally, physically, and spiritually healthy, which is non-trivial when you're trying to grow a company and be entrepreneurial, because you've got about 10 million things hammering on you every day, and oftentimes what you're giving up is your mental, your physical, and your spiritual health, right? And yet, all along the way, to me, if I could keep that, the rest of it came, right? So we keep talking about what does it take to be successful entrepreneur-wise, and like the three things I just listed, none of them had to do with cash flow or getting an MBA or understanding better engineering. All of those are important, but I don't see those as being the foundational as to what does it take to be successful. It was like those three things were all personal attributes, investments in the personal leadership self, as opposed to getting more technical skills.
Well, that's a really good segue into the whole notion of calling. So, of course, for Christians, we believe in divine calling. So when we're looking at entrepreneurial ventures or any business activities for the person, it happens in the context of our calling. So how would you describe your sense of calling and how that shaped your approach to your business activities?
Well, my calling depends what. So I was into my 40s when I started feeling my calling, okay? And really it was about being able to leverage the leadership, the passion I had for leadership, and tying that in with kingdom purpose. And I read a book Wayne Muller's How Then Shall We Live, and he asked 4 key questions in there. Who am I? What do I love? How shall I serve the people of the earth? And so on. And I wrote myself a life plan, a vision plan for me personally. And this is while I was still at Lockheed. And it was an extremely stressful job when I was at Lockheed. I had offices. Well, I had one office 45 minutes away, one office an hour and 20 minutes away, and then one office in San Francisco. And I was spending a lot of time traveling and trying to help change the culture of a 15,000-person organization. And so this calling was all about, I want to be able to wake up every morning, and whatever I'm doing and spending my energy on for that day, it should be furthering the kingdom along in whatever I'm being called into. I didn't know what it was going to be. I really didn't. I had no idea. I maybe have still been at Lockheed, or maybe something else. I didn't really know. But to be called into using my leadership skills to further the kingdom, that was my calling. It was generic, and I didn't know how that was going to play out. And frankly, I don't know how it's going to play out even from here forward in my life. I really don't.
Well, we've got about 3-4 minutes left. I'd like you to just talk about the nonprofit that you're involved with, Pearl. Maybe just describe what it does, why you got involved, and what you're bringing to the organization.
Yeah, so the nonprofit Pearl is for single parents in our community, mostly single moms. So there's about 130 single moms that we support, various programs. There's the handout stuff, and then there's the hand up stuff. We keep 100 cars running with tune-ups and tires and things like that. We have mentoring programs for the kids to help the kids do well in school, because a lot of times they come home at night. The single mom is super busy surviving and doesn't always have the time to help the kids with reading and writing and so on. We help with scholarships, education. Not always college, it just depends on what's right for that particular single mom and the goals that she has written and what she wants to do, but it's to get her in a position of being more sustainable in the community. Why? So the how and the why, I'm going to answer the why first. Why, again, Rick Rusaw, who we've already introduced to this, he challenged a bunch of his business people to do something in the community worthwhile. Use your business skills to do that. So we got together, we talked about it a lot, settled that the single parent issue was a challenge because that was kind of a core thing to keep kids from going into drugs, going into gangs, dropping out of school, suicide rates, and so on. And there's a biblical mandate, widows and orphans, James 1:27, and there's a number of other verses in the Bible that make it a biblical mandate. How? Yeah. How? I think the verse I go back to for the how is Hebrews 11:1, the definition of faith, right? It's, being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Man, I've gone back to that verse a lot. We started this nonprofit 12 years ago, and you think, how hard can it be? I've run organizations, thousands of people, and business, and grown laser business, and got hardware flying around in space. How hard can it be to run a nonprofit? We started it from scratch. It can be really hard. It's a humbling experience. I mean, I have prayed this prayer so many times. It challenges your ego, and God uses it, because when you're on the front lines, it's not just about writing a check and donating money. I mean, it gets messy, it gets gritty on the front lines, and you can get frustrated, and you have to learn to set judgment aside when people make poor decisions that you've been helping. But then there's also what one of my other pastors says is the thing behind the thing. So you start a nonprofit, you start to help somebody because maybe they're more disadvantaged and you can bring resources and so on. So it's all about helping them. But the thing behind the thing is that it's part of your spiritual journey too. I am anywhere close to where I was when I started that nonprofit versus where I am now. How God has worked on me because of running this nonprofit and going through the challenges we've gone through has, and not just me, everybody involved. We have over 200 volunteers that do things with this nonprofit. It's part of their spiritual journey for every single person that's involved. And so I think that's the thing behind the thing. And that's how God works. We're all in it. Sometimes I actually feel guilty because I actually feel like sometimes I'm getting more out of it than some of the clients that we serve. You know, and it's like, it's not supposed to be that way. Well, maybe it is supposed to be that way. So.
Well, we've got time for just one last question. So I wanted to have you comment on the value of individuals, entrepreneurial leaders, getting involved in a nonprofit. So a lot of individuals and entrepreneurs included, you know, they're busy, they're doing lots of stuff, they're running their business, but what would be some encouragement to say, you know what, use those skills for a nonprofit, whether it's being on a board, walking with them in their work, like what have you found to be, say, like, you know, a big benefit to you?
Well, I've described some of that, but oftentimes you don't know what that benefit is going to be. So when you've been called into doing something, you may have to just go with that yes, this is something I need to do, even though I don't really know what the benefit to me is going to be, right? And if you're too busy, I'm sorry, it's not an excuse. I mean, when we started Pearl, I was in the middle of that job at Lockheed, and the year before I'd gone home, I bragged to my wife, who was a single mom when I married her 33 years ago, and I told her how we were going to help single moms and all that, and she goes, "That's great, Hal." And then a year later, we hadn't done anything, and she said,
"That's bad, Hal."
Didn't you know? Well, you know, there was a bunch of chiefs in the room and not enough Indians when we came up with the idea. So I went and I said, "Look, I'm going to do something about this," and I mean, I was in a pretty stressful job, flying all around, but we started it one little step at a time, and it's grown over time. And then you surround yourself with other people that have passions, and maybe they just want to see your leadership and they want to get on board with it. Or maybe you join a board and you don't know why. I mean, I joined the hospital board 6 years ago. I couldn't figure out why, but I went into Scripture. I kept praying on it, looking for the no answer, and it kept coming back, yes, you're supposed to join it. And I'm like, I'm busy enough. I don't want to be on the hospital board. But I joined it because Scripture kept telling me to join it every time I was in prayer on it. And what I learned was, and this is a longer story, not going to do it, but our hospital was acquired by a faith-based hospital. Our hospital wasn't. And there was a mismatch of cultures that was not serving our community well. And I believe that I was instrumental in helping align those cultures under the faith-based culture. And that's why I was invited to be on that board. Could not have told you that when I said yes and I joined it. So, and did I learn some things about my own spiritual journey along the way? You betcha.
That's great. Well, can we thank Hal for his comments?